You'll be back, soon you'll see. You'll remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You'll remember that I served you well. Oceans rise, empires fall. We have seen each other through it all. And when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. Da 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 da. Ha 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 ha. Hello, 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 and welcome to this edition of the Jolly Heretic. And to all of you Americans out there, can I say Happy Independence Day. Happy real Independence Day. For today, September the 3rd, is your real Independence Day, because of course it's on September the 3rd that the King George III, your king, formally granted you independence and recognised that you were a separate country. Now, I would argue that was almost certainly a mistake. But anyway, the point is that I thought it was relevant today because I've been reading the most fascinating book recently, which was recommended to me by our squire, as you know, who is the elder son of a knight or young son of a lord, we're not sure which. And that book is called The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, which is by Eric Kaufman. And it really is something of an eye-opener. And it's what fascinated me about it was there's something which has kind of been suppressed. We're about to go into an election in the United States, and we have somebody, Donald Trump, who's of part German, part Scottish ancestry, and we have Joe Biden. I don't know what he happens to be. And they talk about how America is a melting pot. Is this, or they used to be talked about as a melting pot. Now it's talked about as a kind of mosaic of different peoples. But until relatively recently, we all realise and we all understand that America was overwhelmingly white. As recently as about 1980 or something like that, it was something like 80% white. But if you go back to the 1960s, we have forgotten, we think of America as a white country. It wasn't white. It was English. It was English. It was England overseas. And this is what Eric Kaufman argues in this very interesting book. It was an English nation. A lot of people in America, as recently as 1960, albeit elderly people by that time, not only thought of themselves as English, they thought of themselves as more English than the English, as the real English, as the genuine English. They were a yeoman nation. They were the genuine descendants of Alfred the Great. The people that were running the British Empire and whatever, they weren't English. They weren't Anglo-Saxons. They weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were Normans. They were French. They were garlic-chomping, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. They weren't English. And what he looks at in this book, in a fascinating level of detail, is the extent to which this was the case. And this was accepted. And I didn't know this until I read the book. I didn't know this. This has been hidden even from me. There seems to be this secret, there's this thing that's been suppressed about history, which is that the Americans, until incredibly recently, regarded themselves as English, as I say, more English than the English, in much the same way that the Northern Irish Protestants regard themselves as more British than the British, or the Gibraltarians or the Falklanders regard themselves as more British than the British. You have these people that regard themselves as more English than the English. Absolutely fascinating. And he goes through it that in 1920, for example, these pro-English laws, you had basically a Puritan law. America was established by English Puritans, essentially. It was the English Puritans that migrated, that founded most of these states that we're familiar with. And there's a strong Puritan influence over the culture. I mean, basically, the core of American culture is what the Puritans, give the Puritans in a country, the religious people, their own separate country. I've looked at this before. That's why the American modal personality is different. It's higher in conscientiousness and impulse control because this is associated with religiousness. It's higher in certain aspects of agreeableness. gentleness, which is altruism and empathy, because this is associated with agreeableness. It's basically just higher in religiousness, because the Americans were under strong, well, the descendants, religiousness is about 0.4 genetic, fundamentalist religiousness is about 0.7 genetic. The Americans were under this strong group selection, fighting with the Native Americans and fighting with the Spanish and fighting with all other kinds of other peoples, and this they were highly religious in the first place, and their environment elevated their religiousness. And you have this Puritan laws, therefore, but basically in English Puritanism, banning alcohol in 1920. In 1924, you have a quota that is passed in order to maintain WASP dominance. So you have immigration quotas that are passed to make sure that white Anglo-Saxon, if not English, but white Anglo-Saxon dominance is maintained. In 1928, you have a situation where Al Smith, who was of Irish Catholic descent, lost the presidential election to Herbert Hoover, who was of Protestant German descent, clearly because he was Irish and Catholic, and this was considered unacceptable to a population that regarded themselves as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In the 1960s, there was still a situation where there was effectively a kind of religious segregation. Still, even then, 90% of Protestants married other Protestants. And this only starts to change. You only start to get the breakdown of this Anglo-Saxon America, or rather the manifestation of it breaking down, is as recently as 1960, when of course you have the election of an Irish Catholic president in the form of John F. Kennedy. And after this, it starts to fall apart. But I was amazed to discover the extent to which this was the case. That you've got this, Kaufman argues, you have a very long dominant ethnic phase, a vertical mosaic, he calls it. So you have an absolute dominance of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top, right up until World War II, and to a certain extent up until 1960, when you start to get what he calls the liberal egalitarian sort of phase, when the Enlightenment values of America, the Enlightenment values, the liberal values, really start to publicly displace the ethnic values, essentially, the ethno-state white Anglo-Saxon values, the idea of a yeoman republic. It's absolutely fascinating. So at independence, he notes, America was 60% ethnically English and 98% Protestant. And the English were absolutely overwhelmingly dominant. And even in 1920, the members of the Senate were overwhelmingly ethnically English. He notes that you have the Puritan North, that was founded by the Puritans, by these religious fundamentalists that were based in England, and the Cavalier South, that was founded by traders and merchants and people like that rather than religious fundamentalists. But still, both were founded by the English. And then, of course, he doesn't look at this, but you have Utah, and there was Utah is genetically the most English state now in the United States. It's overwhelmingly ethnically English. And there was a point, actually, at which there were more Mormons in Great Britain than there were in Utah, and they were all converted by the campaigns of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and people like this, and they were brought over to America to found Utah. And he looks at this, at the way that you have the revival in New England in the 1720s under Jacob Edwards, and he says that this is the Great Awakening, and this is heavily influenced by English Puritanism, by English ideas, by English religious ideals. It's basically Englishness abroad. He notes that you have then the neoclassical movement, that you've got this starts in England, and you have the rise of neoclassical architecture and things like this. It starts in England, but of course the bonds between what is basically England West and England are so strong in the 1700s that you have this neoclassical movement in America, and you have towns given names like Augusta and Athens and all of these kinds of places. And he then looks at the sort of ethnic mythos, basically, of Americans as recorded in the 18th and 19th, and even in the late 19th and even early 20th century. And you basically have this idea that they are British people in America. They are British people who have come to America. They are rootless. They have migrated. They are alien, but they are God's people. They are the chosen people, the people of the Lord, who have been sent from England, which is their ethnic homeland, their birthright, to colonize America. And they saw themselves very strongly as Anglo-Saxon, as Protestant English. And the difference was that they were liberal, they were Whig, if you like. They were sceptical of things like monarchy and these sorts of ancient traditional institutions. So they were, in a certain sense, very, very pro-religious and anti-traditional, and that was what made them different from the English. And what I was particularly fascinated to discover was the mythos that they had, which Kaufman looks at, which is the idea that they were the real Anglo-Saxons, the genuine Anglo-Saxons, and that there were certain Anglo-Saxon liberties, a sort of equality, a sort of enlightenment dimension to Anglo-Saxon life. It's a complete myth, of course, but the idea that they were all similar and that there wasn't a real aristocracy, and they were all the same, and the Anglo-Saxons were all these kind of good, hard-working farmers and tillers of the soil. There's perhaps a certain degree of truth in it. That the Anglo-Saxons were more democratic, that the Anglo-Saxons had these sort of semi-democratic institutions and all these sort of liberties and freedoms. And this was taken away from the English when the Normans conquered England, and the feudal system and Norman rule and all of this sort of French rule, basically foreign rule, foreign concepts, was imposed on England, and these liberties were revived in the 1600s. And round about that time, this is argued, this is the mythos, what you begin to see is the rise of the yeoman. So you begin to see the displacement of the traditional ruling class of England, who are Norman, who are all descended from Normans. And at the time of the Black Death, you have this massive, 40% of people, 40% of the population of England are killed, 80% of the labourers are killed, and consequently there's a huge sort of social movement of people who are of low born, who are serfs, or who are just ordinary farmers, who are yeomen rather than gentlemen and knights and members of the nobility, people who are the so-called middling sort, start to rise up and rise to the top. So before then, the country had been completely ruled by people who were descended from Normans and had Norman surnames, locative surnames, like mine, Dutton, which my ancestors were lords of the manor of Dutton in Cheshire, and they were Normans. And you start to get people that have Anglo-Saxon surnames, like Smith, surnames that imply that they're middle class, Smith and Farmer and whatever else, these sort of middle class surnames that relate to a job that an ancestor of theirs did, or just surnames that relate to Johnson and things like this. And these people start to rise up into positions of power. And a fascinating analysis of wills in the 16th century indicates that these people, who were also highly religious, had the highest fertility in England. They left more descendants than did the nobility, who were kind of dying out. And so they began to displace them, basically. Around about the 16th century, you have the rise of the middling sort, you have the rise of the middle class, and you have growing middle class, or as it was called, middling sort influence on England. And according to this American mythos, these are the Puritans. These are exactly the people, these middling sort, who become the Puritans. They have somehow kept the fire burning of these Anglo-Saxon liberties for all these centuries, and then they bring them over to America. You have people like John Quincy who argued this. You have Sam Adams, who argued, we have come to America, we have taken back English freedom from these Normans, Samuel Adams, from these Normans, and we are bringing about the real England, the genuine England, the Anglo-Saxon England, the pre-conquest England here in America. We are the true English. George Washington was highly sympathetic with this idea, that we are the true English. We are a tribe of Anglo-Saxon people. John Adams argued that ultimately what was being kept alive in America was that the Americans were the real descendants of Hengist and Horsa. Hengist and Horsa being the original founders of the Anglo-Saxons. The Americans were the real descendants of the Anglo-Saxon chiefs. The Americans were the ones that were keeping alive the real spirit of the Anglo-Saxons. They had an idea that the Americans, the English, the Anglo-Saxons had escaped from the Norman yoke. What England was Normandy. England was Norman rule. England was French. England wasn't really England at all. Britain was something else. It was Norman, it was foreign, and they could re-establish this genuine Anglo-Saxon England in America. Roosevelt in 1889 talked about this. He compared the situation of the Americans to the Anglo-Saxons and the British as being the Normans. Who were the non-English? The non-English, they argued, as part of this mythos, as you started to get Germans and kindred ethnic peoples coming into the country, they started to argue that the Germans, the German immigrants into America, that they could be anglicised. They were basically Anglo-Saxon. They were cultural cousins. They were a similar sort of thing. They could be brought into this anglicised kind of idea. And the main enemies of America were therefore the Norman English, the Catholic Mexicans, Spanish, whatever, the Catholic French. And so what you have is this religio-ethnic idea of the Americans as the genuine Anglo-Saxons, the real Anglo-Saxons, more Anglo-Saxon than the English themselves, and also, of course, the true Christians, God's true people to a much greater extent than the decadent Anglo-Saxons themselves. Now, this is quite extraordinary that this kind of thing isn't known about more. This idea that was there till really very recently, that they're English. You have in the Romantic movement, Walt Whitman, what did he want to do? He tried to Anglicize the language. He tried to purge American English of Norman influences, of French influences, of foreign influences, and come up with a kind of really pure English. He was absolutely fascinated by this. In 1800, with the rise of the Irish, you have a strong anti-immigrant, essentially pro-English movement that develops in America, known as the Know Nothings. By 1890, people were angry about the fact that Boston was becoming taken over by the Irish, and they actually stated publicly that there was someone that stated publicly that they were nostalgic for the days when Boston was rather like an English village. And Eric Kaufman quotes someone as saying this, that there was a point when Boston was lovely. It was like an English village, warm beer and cricket and whatever. It was a lovely, wonderful place. Jack London, in his novel, one of his novels in 1913, The Valley of the Mean or something, and he has the main character is called Saxon Brown. And it's a Saxon, obviously, and then Brown being one of these middling sort Anglo-Saxon surnames. And Saxon Brown is basically nostalgic for the 1870s. That's what it's about. It's nostalgia for the 1870s, before the Irish arrived, before all the foreigners arrived, back in the days when America was England West, when America was this Anglo-Saxon place. And that's what the novel is about this nostalgia for the Anglo-Saxon England that has been lost with the rise of Irish immigration, as well as, of course, by then immigration from lots of other places, and the movement into the melting pot sort of stage. I thought this was absolutely fascinating stuff. Kaufman argues that the Ku Klux Klan can, to a certain extent, be argued as an ethnic nationalist movement. If people talk about the Ku Klux Klan as being a white racist, a white nationalist movement, no. That's not true. That's inaccurate. That may be the case now, I don't know. But then it was a WASP movement. It was very specifically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement. They were quite clear that they reject Catholics. It was an anti-Catholic movement. In some respects, it was as much when it started to move outside of the South. So Kaufman argues, well, in the South, what motivated it in the South was that it was anti-black. But it moved well outside of the slave areas and of the South and whatever. It moved all around America. And what motivated it in those parts of America was, well, there weren't black people for them to be opposed to. It was just foreigners, people that weren't Anglo-Saxons. That was the problem. That's what they were opposed to, and people that weren't Protestant. So basically, Kaufman argues that the Ku Klux Klan itself, for most American people, it wasn't a white movement, it was an Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement, because that is the founding mythos of America, as an Anglo-Saxon Protestant place. And that's how Americans perceived themselves in the 30s and whatever, when the Klan was at its height, very strongly, the 20s, perceived themselves as an Anglo-Saxon Protestant people, very specifically, who were more Anglo-Saxon than the English back home, and who were more Protestant, more genuinely Protestant, more God's people, more sort of Calvinist or whatever, than the English back home. A Puritan Anglo-Saxon ethnic group. Somebody actually asked me on my live show the other day, could the Americans be regarded as a separate ethnic group? And I was sceptical about this because of the way in which partly because of this, that they perceived themselves as ethnically English. And even those, Kaufman argues, that even those who were not ethnically English, so even once you get this mixing, even once, as the 19th century progresses, and you get more and more people, as long as they're Protestant, and as long as they're, as long as they're reasonably similar in ethnic terms to the English, such as the Germans and the Dutch and people like this, and the Scandinavians, then it was strongly felt that they could be assimilated into this mould of basically being ethnic English. And you see this in programs like, I don't know, Little House on the Prairie or whatever, where you have people in that, minor characters in it, who are Scandinavians, but because they are Scandinavian, they are relatively similar to the English, they're kind of semi-Saxon, and they're Protestant, and consequently they can be brought in to this overarching system, this vertical ethnic system, whereby you have a central and clear cultural core, which no one is questioning. No one's questioning really until the 50s or the early 60s, that America is an English nation. Then you start to get this sort of double consciousness, argues Kaufman, which begins perhaps at the beginning of towards the end of the 19th century, where you have increasingly immigration, and you have increasingly this sense of being liberal, and if you're liberal, then you should favour these Enlightenment values and the brotherhood of man, and all men are created equal, and this Enlightenment aspect starts to be very strongly played up. But then on the other hand, people still have this idea of America as English, of America as Anglo-Saxon, of America as ultimately an ethnic place surrounded by foreigners, the Native Americans, the Mexicans, the French, and so on. In the 1920s, he argues, very interesting this, you have a frequent reapportion of seats based on the census, and by 1921 the population had changed so much that it was very, very un-Anglo-Saxon. It was increasingly becoming un-Anglo-Saxon. Now, the people that were of Anglo-Saxon descent overwhelmingly lived in rural areas by 1921 and were farmers, and there was this conception of a yeoman republic, as I said. Now, what a yeoman republic was in the hierarchy of England, you have at the top the nobility, then you have the gentry, which is people that have the right to bear, which is kind of large landowners that have the right to bear coat armour, sort of lower nobility, basically. That's what we're talking about. A lower nobility who are seen as a separate class. And below them you have the yeomen, and the yeomen are non-noble. They don't have the right to bear coat armour. They're not as wealthy as the gentlemen. They do some physical labour themselves, but they are wealthy and successful. That's what the yeomen were. And so they see themselves as wealthy, successful, non-aristocratic English. Now, and they all live in the countryside. Now, the idea was to continuously reapportion the seats in the American legislature based on the census to ensure that it was in line, to ensure that it was fair, to ensure that it was in line with the nature of the census, so to ensure that the cities had sufficient representation and all this sort of thing. In 1921, for the first time, apparently, the American House of Representatives, or whatever it was, voted not to do this. They refused to do this. They refused to change the seat apportionments in line with the census. And the reason was because they wanted to keep the legislature basically rural. They wanted to keep rural dominance in the legislature. And the reason they wanted to do that was because they wanted to keep English dominance in the legislature. They wanted to keep things English. By this time, you're getting a romanticisation of the Appalachians. Why? Well, because it's totally English. There's very, very little immigration by that time anyway, from anywhere. The people there, it's an enclave which very people go into. It's totally English. I was in the Appalachians. I was in Kentucky and Tennessee some years ago. It was overwhelming. You didn't see anybody foreign there. And you saw all these names. I went past a graveyard in the area, and all these obscure English surnames like Wasp and things that have kind of died out in England, but were preserved in those that went to America. Wasp, as I wrote. And he argues that the George Wallace campaign in the 1960s, was it 68, presidential election campaign, was basically an Anglo-Saxon resurgence, an Anglo-Saxon fight back, an Anglo-Saxon campaign, and it gradually has fallen away, and it seems to have been kind of lost from the cultural memory that America was Anglo-Saxon and perceived itself as being more Anglo-Saxon than the Anglo-Saxons and basically being England West. I just thought this was extremely interesting and worth talking about on Today of All Days. He's not very good on the theory, is Kaufman. In terms of the theory, in terms of why it's fallen apart, it seems fairly obvious that they, to me anyway, that they allowed immigration that wasn't Protestant and that wasn't Anglo-Saxon, and this of course leads to lowering in terms of social trust, and it also leads to distrust between members of the ethnic group, because they see foreigners as people who other less loyal co-ethnics can collaborate against them with. And so trust tends to decline, and you tend to have a more limited sense of positive ethnocentrism and a more limited sense of negative ethnocentrism for that reason, because these things are based around trust. And so consequently, as the Irish increase in size, then they're going to act in their own interests, and their interests as well presumably be to act to undermine a sense of Anglo-Saxonness and a sense of Anglo-Saxon unity in America, and the Anglo-Saxon unity anyway is being undermined simply by their presence. And then, of course, the fact that you have other foreigners who are coming in by that stage who are even more different, who are even more ethnically different than the Irish, such as Russians and people from all over the shop, basically. And all of those things together could presumably persuade people to identify more with being simply white rather than being Anglo-Saxon. And that's clearly happened, or Protestant, and that's clearly happened because you're in a situation where in the 2004 election, the majority of Catholics identifying as right-wing white Catholics voted for George W. Bush, rather than John Kerry, who was an Irish Catholic, which Kaufman points out would have been extraordinary. So these kinds of factors, basically the rise of just too many non-Anglos basically in America, Anglos coming to a position of influence, Anglos pushing the culture away from non-Anglos, pushing the culture away from Anglo-ness, and also I suppose becoming less religious as well, and religion becoming less important because and becoming less ethnocentric as well because of higher living standards, and all these kinds of factors come together to see the slow death of Anglo-Saxon America. And it's the death is now so substantial that it's been forgotten about. It's been forgotten about. And I think we can all agree that we need to we shouldn't forget about this. We need to make America great again. And the way we can make America great again at the moment, I mean, look, it's in absolute chaos, I think, is for it to become part, once again, of a truly Anglo-Saxon England, because ultimately I think Americans realise deep down that's what they want, that's what they are, and that's perhaps what their future should be. Well, I hope you have enjoyed the show, and if you have, then there are ways you can see below ways to support the channel. If you would like to do that, please subscribe. It really helps if you do that, and please spread the word about the channel and all that. I live stream on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. in England West, and I will see you soon, and goodbye.